Chapter 1: Snowfallen Strangers. Josie turned from the door and crossed to the kitchen area, her boots tracking thin trails of melting snow across the worn pine floor. The radio sat on the counter, its crackle fading into static. She silenced it with a thumb pressed to the power button, a habit born from months of preferring the cabin's silence to any voice from the outside world. Titan remained at the door, his massive head turned toward the woodline. His whine came again, lower this time, a sound that vibrated through the cabin's timbers. "Stop it," she said, not harshly, never harshly to him. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had argued with silence for too long. "It's just weather." But Titan didn't move. His pale eyes tracked something she couldn't see, something beyond the wall of white that now obscured the tree line entirely. The wind screamed against the clapboards, and somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under the weight of accumulating snow. Josie paused at the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Through the small window above the basin, the world had vanished. Just white. Just the storm. She had chosen this, sold everything, bought the cabin under a false name, let Titan alert the neighbors the night she swallowed pills and washed them down with whiskey until the world went black. The mastiff's warning broke through her thoughts. She turned. Titan had moved from the door. He stood now in the center of the main room, his massive body angled toward the corner where Pat's hunting rifle lay beneath the bedrolls. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that could tear through bone. Something was wrong. Josie's body moved before her mind caught up. She crossed the cabin in 3 strides, dropped to her knees beside the bedrolls, and pulled the rifle free. The action was automatic, muscle memory from a life she'd tried to bury. Her hands checked the chamber, the magazine, the safety. The weight of the wood and steel settled into her palms like an old friend she hadn't realized she'd missed. The knock came then. 3 steady raps against the cabin's outer door, spaced with deliberate patience. Then a voice, barely audible through the howling wind. "Please, I need help." The words were in English, but they carried an accent she couldn't place. Male, weakened, the kind of voice that came from someone who had already accepted they might die. Titan's growl vibrated through the room, low and threatening. Josie rose to her feet, rifle raised, and moved toward the door. Her eyes found the peephole, an old brass thing Pat had installed years ago. She pressed her face to it. A man knelt in the snow outside, his expensive coat torn and darkened with something that wasn't snow, blood. His left hand pressed to his side, and his other arm braced against the doorframe to keep himself upright. His eyes, dark, desperate, found the peephole. He knew she was watching. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, each word costing him, "but if you don't let me in, I'll die out here." Behind her, Titan's growl deepened. Josie's finger rested against the trigger guard, her pulse steady despite the man bleeding on her doorstep. She had spent months running from the world. Now the world had come to her. Josie lowered the rifle. The man's eyes held no threat, only the glassy determination of someone who had run out of options. She recognized that look. It was the same one she'd seen in the ER mirror the night Pat died, when the doctors delivered news that shattered every future she'd imagined. She unlatched the deadbolt. He didn't rush. That surprised her. He pushed himself upright with a grunt, his hands slick with blood that painted the doorframe as he steadied himself. Titan's growl became a rumble, but the dog held his position, waiting, assessing. "I'm Nico," the man said. His English was careful, precise. "Thank you?" Josie stepped back, rifle still raised, and watched him cross the threshold. He moved like a man conserving every drop of energy left in his body, each step deliberate. Behind him, the storm swallowed the world. Nothing existed beyond the door but white chaos. He collapsed onto the sofa before she could stop him, his expensive coat leaving a smear of red against the worn leather. His hand pressed harder against his side, and she could see now the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Nico's lips curved. "Not quite a smile. They're the only thing keeping me from bleeding out." Josie set the rifle against the wall within arm's reach. "Then you'd better hope I decide you're worth saving." She crossed to the bathroom and pulled open the cabinet above the sink. Bandages, antiseptic, suture kit. Her hands moved automatically, selecting what she'd need. The medical part of her brain The part she'd tried to bury surfaced like a body from deep water. When she returned, Nico had closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow, his skin the color of old wax. Titan stood over him, massive head lowered, nostrils flaring as he sampled the stranger's scent. Down, Josie commanded. Titan didn't move. He's hurt, not threatening. Down. The mastiff retreated slowly, reluctantly, to his bed in the corner, his pale eyes never leaving the man on the sofa. Josie knelt beside Nico and began cutting away his shirt. The wound was deep, a gash that ran from his ribs to his hip. Not a bullet wound. Something else, blade, maybe, or glass. "You were in an accident," she said, not a question, something like that. His eyes opened, dark, as she'd seen through the peephole. But now they held something else, a wariness that matched her own. "What's your real name, Nico?" He winced as she pressed a gauze pad against the wound. "That's all that matters right now." The wind screamed outside. Snow pelted the roof like thrown gravel. Josie worked in silence, her fingers finding the rhythm of stitches she'd performed 100 times in another life. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. Blood stained her hands. The bandage was tight, the bleeding slowed. "You'll live." Nico's eyes had drifted closed again. "I owe you, you owe me nothing." She stood, moving toward the sink. "You leave when the storm clears." Behind her she heard his voice, barely above a whisper. "It's not that simple." Josie let the water run over her hands, watching the red swirl down the drain. Nothing was ever simple. She'd learned that the hard way. Titan's low growl vibrated through the cabin, and she felt it in her bones. Josie pulled on her heavy canvas jacket and faced Titan at the threshold. "Stay." The word came out harder than she intended. Titan's ears flattened, his pale eyes fixed on her with an expression that bordered on accusation. He didn't move from his bed. "I mean it." She forced herself to turn away from him, from the warmth of the cabin, from the wounded man sleeping on her sofa. The door opened to a wall of white. The storm had intensified, the wind screaming down from the peaks with a fury that made her eyes water. Her boots broke through the crust of snow covering the porch steps. Each step downslope was a battle, the path barely visible, the powder deeper than it looked, her thighs burning with the effort of lifting her feet high enough to avoid the drifts that had built against the trees. She moved like someone who had trained her body to endure. Her mind had learned to separate from discomfort long ago, the way it had separated from grief, from hope, from anything that threatened to pull her back into the world of living. The rental cabin emerged from the white like a ghost. Modern. A-frame, the large windows dark, no smoke rising from the chimney. She'd forgotten she'd even owned this property. It had come with the main cabin through some Shell LLC arrangement after Pat's death, a detail she'd never bothered to understand. She tried the door. Locked. The lock was old, the hinges weak. She forced it with a shoulder and the interior was shocked into sudden cold air and silence, shadowed, dim. And then she saw him. A man slumped on the floor near a gas fireplace, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. His left shoulder was dark with blood. His face was pale, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Josie's medical training activated before her fear could settle. She knelt beside him, her hands moving with practiced precision to assess the wound. The bullet entry was clean, upper left chest cavity, and the wound had been crudely sutured. Professionally, actually. Her eyes narrowed. The stitches were too precise, too clinical, for a random accident. The man's eyes fluttered open. They were black, dark as obsidian, and for a moment they locked with Josie's blue-gray gaze. His voice, when it came, was hoarse but controlled. "I need help." In those 3 words was an accent, Italian, and an authority that contradicted the weakness of his body. Josie's eyes scanned the cabin, an overturned chair, a window shattered from the outside bullet hole in the glass, and near the man's hip a discarded wheelchair, empty. She processed this contradiction with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned not to trust what she was told. "Car accident?" she asked, though she already knew the answer was no. The man's gaze didn't waver, drove off the road in the storm. Couldn't make it far. He coughed, a sound like gravel and water. "Please, I'll pay you. Whatever you need." Josie's jaw tightened. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a burner phone, something she carried for emergencies. No signal. The storm had closed the world into a radius of white and wind. Her internal calculus was swift. Leave him, and he dies. Stay, and she risks contamination from whatever world he carries in his expensive watch, his blood, his accent, and the careful lie he'd already told her. She made her choice. Can you move? My legs don't work. It was a statement, delivered with such flatness that it became another kind of truth. Not the truth of his body, but the truth of what he needed her to believe. Josie lifted him. She was stronger than she looked, her body lean and muscled from months of solitary labor, and half dragged, half carried him toward the door. He was heavy, and the distance to her cabin felt suddenly vast. As they reached the threshold, the man's hand gripped her jacket. Thank you, he whispered, and there was something in that gratitude, something like a man who had learned that survival is a transaction, and that people always collect their debts. Josie half dragged, half carried him through the deepening snow. The wind tried to knock her off balance twice, but she planted her feet and kept moving. The man's weight settled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow against her neck. Titan was waiting at the door when she pushed it open with her hip. The mastiff's growl hit her like a physical force, that low, vibrating thunder that made the air feel thick. His yellow eyes locked onto the stranger in her arms, lips pulling back from teeth like tombstones. Guard. Josie shifted the man's weight to one arm, raised her other hand, palm up toward Titan. Guard, not attack. Titan's ears flattened, his massive body remained rigid, but the growl quieted to a rumble, then to a watchful silence. His eyes never left the man she laid on the sofa. The stranger's control fractured as pain moved through him. His jaw clenched so hard she saw the muscle jump beneath his bloodied skin. His eyes closed, and for a moment he looked almost human, vulnerable, stripped of whatever armor he'd been wearing out there. Josie retrieved her first aid kit from the bedroom closet. It was heavier than most people's emergency supplies, a legacy of her years in the ER, the instinct to be ready for anything. She returned to find the man's eyes open again, watching her with that dark, calculating gaze. "What's your name?" She pulled on latex gloves, her tone clinical, hands already reaching for the antiseptic. "Nico." He caught himself, something like frustration flashing across his face. "Nico. Nico Rossi." Josie heard the lie in the correction. She filed it away without comment. She worked in silence for several minutes, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. The bullet had entered high in his chest, missing anything vital by some miracle, or perhaps just by design. The existing stitches were precise, too precise for a backcountry accident. Her fingers moved across his bare skin, probing, assessing, repairing. Her hands knew this work. They had saved hundreds of lives in the bright chaos of the ER, and now they moved with the same automatic precision in the dim quiet of her cabin. "You were shot." She said it flatly. Not a question. "Car accident." His eyes met hers, holding steady. "The wheelchair downslope. The one you're not using despite claiming your legs don't work." Something shifted in his expression, a recalculation, a reassessment of who she was. "You're perceptive. I'm practical." She taped fresh gauze over the wound with careful precision. "And I don't need to know your story. The blizzard will break by tomorrow evening, maybe morning after. You'll leave, and we both pretend this never happened. And if I can't move," the challenge in his voice was new, real authority beneath the performance of weakness. She met his eyes. "Then you'll stay until you can. But you'll understand something. I'm not interested in what you are. I'm interested in keeping my home intact. That means you don't lie to me inside these walls. You understand?" Nico nodded slowly. Something like respect moved through his gaze, recognition of her clarity, her refusal to be seduced by his vulnerability. "Understood." Josie finished bandaging and stepped back. "You'll sleep here. Bathrooms through there, don't bleed on the blankets." She turned toward the fire, added a log, and settled into her chair. Titan positioned himself between her and the sofa, his massive body a silent sentinel. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, an uneasy truce settled, two strangers separated by a dog that smelled deception the way others smelled fear. Chapter 2: The Storm and the Truth. The gray light that crept through the windows told her it was barely dawn. Josie's neck ached from sleeping on the sofa, and for a moment she lay still, cataloging the unfamiliar weight of another person in her home. Nico was already awake. He sat upright on the sofa, one arm braced against his ribs, watching the embers of the fire with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. His bandages were clean, no seeping red, no signs of internal bleeding. He'd managed to dress himself in the clothes she'd left folded on the chair, worn jeans that hung low on his hips, a faded Henley that did nothing to hide the breadth of his shoulders. In the pale morning light, without the performance of helplessness, he looked like someone entirely different. His spine was straight, his hands rested open on his knees. There was an ease to him now, a settling into command, as though the act of pretending to be broken had exhausted him. Josie rose without comment and moved to the kitchen. The routine came automatically. Coffee grounds into the filter, water from the filtered jug, the press of the button. She added wood to the fire, checked the generator's fuel level through the small window, verified the storm's slow retreat by the diminished howl of wind. Her body knew these motions the way it knew breathing, automatic, unthinking. But she felt him watching. His gaze moved across her back like a searchlight, cataloging, recalibrating. She could feel the weight of it between her shoulder blades, the way it made her stand straighter, move more deliberately. A man who read threats for a living. She refused to turn around. "How's the pain?" She asked it without turning, her voice flat, practical, as she measured grounds for a second cup. "Manageable." His voice was lower in the morning, rougher. She heard the truth in it. He wasn't lying. She poured the second cup and finally turned. He sat exactly as she'd left him, but the angle was different. Deliberate, controlled. The posture of a man who had learned to suffer without showing it. She brought him the broth without asking whether he wanted it. He took it with a nod, and she watched his hands as he lifted the spoon, steady, precise, no tremor despite the wound in his chest. His breathing was even, measured, a man trained to mask what hurt. "Why do you care?" The question came suddenly, his dark eyes catching hers over the rim of the cup. "You don't know me. You think I'm a criminal. Why not turn me in when the storm clears?" Josie sat across from him, her coffee warming her palms. "Because turning you in would require me to interact with the world. I've worked very hard to avoid that." She took a sip, let the silence stretch. "Also, you'd be dead before anyone arrived. I'm a nurse. Dead is something I try to prevent, even for people I don't like." The corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of something that might have been a laugh. It broke across his face like light through clouds, sudden and surprising.
You're remarkable, practical.
She corrected him the way she had before. "There's a difference." The day passed in careful adjacency. She changed his bandages, checked for infection, noted the way his body responded to her touch, still, controlled, giving nothing away. She brought him food. He ate what she provided without complaint. They occupied the same space without occupying each other, and somehow that was worse. By evening, the storm had thinned enough that she could see the tree line through the clearing snow. She built the fire higher, and they sat in the amber glow, Titan positioned between them like a furry buffer, his massive body a silent judgment. The pain medication she'd given him had softened the edge of his awareness. He leaned back against the sofa, his eyes half-lidded, less guarded than before.
Do you have a name?
He asked. "Or are you just the nurse who rescues criminals from their own stupidity?"
Josephine.
"Josie." She didn't offer more, but something in the silence prompted her, some strange need to match his earlier confession with one of her own.
I had a husband, firefighter, and a daughter.
She paused, felt the words like stones in her throat.
She lived for 48 hours.
Nico didn't offer condolences. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, and the nod contained something she hadn't expected: recognition. Not of her loss, but of the weight of carrying it. "I had a father," he said quietly. "I was there when he died. I watched it happen, and I couldn't stop it." His eyes were distant, fixed on something she couldn't see. That was 9 years ago. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind dropped further. The storm's breaking point was near. Josie woke to an empty sofa. Her hand moved before her eyes opened, reaching beneath the pile of bedrolls where she kept the rifle. Her fingers found cold metal, and for one stuttering heartbeat she thought he'd vanished, slipped out into the snow, left her with nothing but bloodstains on her cushions and the weight of a decision she'd never asked for. Then she heard it, the soft click of the bathroom door closing. She exhaled slowly, her jaw tight. He was still here. He hadn't abandoned her. The phrase arrived unbidden, strange and sharp, and she shoved it away before it could take root. While the water ran in the bathroom, she moved. His jacket lay draped over the chair by the fire, the cashmere one, dark and luxurious, now crumpled and damp from his trek through the snow. She'd noticed it last night but hadn't thought anything of it. Now she folded back the lapel with the precision of a woman searching for evidence. The inner pocket yielded a satellite phone, sleek and encrypted looking, heavier than it should have been. and cash $100 bills, banded tight, thick enough to signal real money, not the desperate stash of a man fleeing an accident. She counted quickly in her head, 50,000, perhaps more.
Huh?
Her chest tightened. This was not a man who'd stumbled into her life by chance. This was a man who'd prepared to disappear. She replaced the jacket exactly as she'd found it and stepped back just as the bathroom door opened. Nico emerged damp-haired, moving carefully to avoid straining his wound. He caught the shift in her immediately. She could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, the way his posture adjusted. He looked at the jacket, then back at her face, and something in his expression settled. "Josie," he started. "The storm's breaking," she said. Her voice came out flat, deliberate, the words a wall built stone by stone. "You'll be able to move by tomorrow, I'd expect." He read her. Of course he read her. His gaze moved to the jacket again, then returned to her face. "You know, I know enough. Not intentionally." His voice was quiet, but the words carried weight. "But if people know I'm alive, if they find me, your cabin becomes a target. Then you leave today. I can't." Something like desperation crept into his tone. "The wound isn't healed. Moving now could trigger bleeding. I need 2 more days, minimum." Josie stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky hung pale and bruised, and the road downslope, while still treacherous, was passable. She could demand he leave. She could demand he never had come. "You're hiding from someone," she said to the glass. "Yes, someone powerful. Yes, someone who would come here if they knew you existed." His silence was confirmation enough. She turned back to him. "Then we need to establish something. I don't want your money. I don't want your protection. If someone comes to my door asking about you, I'll tell them the truth. I'm not going to lie to protect you. I'm not that invested in your survival." It was a lie. She knew it. She could see in his dark eyes that he knew it too. She would have left him in that cabin to die if she didn't care. She would have never brought him here, but she needed the wall between them, this fiction of indifference, to maintain the boundary she'd spent months constructing. Nico nodded slowly. "Fair. 2 more days. Then I'm gone, and you never see me again." Josie nodded, but something inside her was already beginning to crack. The morning came clear and cold, the sky a hard blue that mocked the chaos of the previous nights. Josie stood at the window, watching the sun hit the snow and transform it into a field of diamonds. The wind had died. The drifts had settled into soft curves against the trees. She heard Nico behind her, the soft shuffle of bare feet on wood, the catch of his breath as he moved. He'd been sleeping heavily, the fever breaking sometime in the night. She'd checked his temperature at dawn, her hand pressed to his forehead before she could stop herself. Cool. Normal. The crisis passed. "The road," he asked. She didn't turn. "Muddy. Thaws making it worse than the snow. Could be another day, maybe 2." He moved past her, close enough that she caught the clean scent of soap, her soap, the cheap kind she bought in bulk. He stopped at the window, standing beside her, not touching. His reflection appeared in the glass, hollowed and pale, but his eyes were clear and sharp. "You didn't tell me. You didn't ask." A pause. Then something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Fair." The day unfolded in strange rhythms. Nico stood for the first time since arriving, testing his weight on the leg that had been punctured. He moved carefully, but the control was there, the economy of motion that came from knowing exactly what his body could do. No more play acting at helplessness. He walked to the window. He sat at the small wooden table. He poured himself coffee without asking. Josie watched and said nothing. Titan tracked every movement. The mastiff had been curled by the fire, but now he lifted his massive head, yellow eyes following Nico's circuit of the room. A low rumble built in his chest. "Titan," Josie said quietly. "Down." The dog didn't lower his head. His eyes stayed fixed on Nico, and the rumble deepened. Nico stopped moving. He stood in the center of the room, hands loose at his sides, and let Titan look. The silence stretched. Josie's hand drifted toward the rifle. Then Titan yawned, a massive theatrical display of canine indifference, and dropped his head back to his paws. Josie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The afternoon light lengthened, golden and soft, and Nico wandered toward the mantel. His fingers brushed the framed photograph there, Josie and a man, young and laughing, a small wooden house behind them. He studied it for a long moment. "How long?" he asked. Josie was chopping vegetables for soup, her hands busy, mechanical. 3 years. The fire was called in, but the building came down faster than anyone predicted. He was inside, running search and rescue. The collapse caught him.
Your daughter.
The knife stopped. Born 6 weeks early, respiratory complications. We got to hold her, but only for 2 days. Her voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a nurse recounting a file, but her hands had stilled on the knife. The hardest part was that she was so small, so impossibly small. And then she was just gone. Nico set the photograph back, with great care. What was her name? Margot. The name sounded foreign in her mouth, a word she hadn't spoken in months. We called her Maggie. He nodded, and there was something ancient in his expression, the look of a man who understood that some kinds of loss unmake a person. That evening, Josie found him on the porch, staring at the moonlit mountains. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, a gesture of care she couldn't quite justify, and didn't try to. My father was supposed to retire, Nico said into the darkness. He was going to hand over the business to someone else, someone he'd been training for years. But his replacement got greedy, started making moves without permission, and my father went to have a conversation with him. It was supposed to be simple. It wasn't, Josie said. No, the replacement had already cut a deal with another faction. My father walked into a trap. 3 bullets. I was there. He'd brought me along because I was learning the business. I was supposed to be there to listen and learn. Instead, I watched him die in a restaurant full of people who did nothing. How old were you? 19. Josie processed this. A man shaped by violence at an age when most people are still learning to be civil. Is that when you took over? Eventually. There was a period of transition. But yes, by 21, I was the one making decisions, the one people had to answer to. He turned to her. I've spent the last 9 years becoming the kind of man who could prevent what happened to my father. I've become very good at it, and very good at the cost of becoming very good at it. Josie understood that this was confession, that he was stripping away the lie about accident and paralysis, offering her something closer to truth. Not redemption, but honesty about the weight he carried. The people coming for you, she said quietly, are they people you hurt? Yes, do they deserve to hurt you back? Nico was silent for a long moment. Then, probably. They stood on the porch in the moonlight, neither quite ready to go inside, both understanding that the line between safety and danger had blurred beyond recognition. The warmth of his palm against hers was startling, calloused, harder than she expected, the skin rough from years of work she couldn't quite imagine. Josie's fingers curled around his without deciding to, an automatic response to something deeper than thought. They stood like that for a long moment, neither speaking, neither needing to. The mountains held their silence around them, and the cold bit at their bare feet, but neither moved. You should go inside, Nico finally said. You'll freeze out here. So will you. I've survived worse. She almost laughed at that. His voice had shifted back to the careful, measured tone she'd come to know, the one that measured every word. But his hand didn't let go. Come inside with me, she said instead. Nico's eyebrows rose. That's an invitation. That's a practicality. You're still healing, and frostbite isn't convenient for either of us. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the warmth of the moment dissolving into something more manageable, logistics, survival, the language she knew best. He nodded once and followed her inside. The fire had burned low, embers glowing orange in the dark cabin. Josie added another log, the sparks crackling and spiraling upward. Titan lifted his head at their return, then settled back down, apparently satisfied that the strange man would stay. They sat at the small table across from each other, the satellite phone still visible in Nico's jacket where he'd left it on the chair. The weight of his confession hung between them, mafia, betrayal, a man who had ordered deaths and watched his father bleed out in a restaurant. What happens now? Josie asked. With Carmine, with Chicago. Nico's jaw tightened. My people are moving. The call was to consolidate what I have left, loyalists who haven't been turned or eliminated.
We have maybe 48 hours before the trail goes cold and he starts widening his search. And you're going to fight him. I have to. It's not about territory or money at this point. It's about survival. If I run, I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. If I stay and fight, I either win or I die trying.
Josie absorbed this. A man who had spent 9 years building an empire was prepared to burn it down rather than let someone else take it. She understood that kind of stubbornness. It was the same force that had driven her to buy this cabin, to disappear, to refuse the slow bleed of grief that threatened to drown her. Then we leave at dawn, she said. I'll pack enough for a few days. You have contacts in Montana? Somewhere less remote, Cheyenne. I have people there.
Good. We take my truck. It's less conspicuous than whatever brought you here.
She was already planning the route, the checkpoints, the variables she could control. Nico watched her with something like wonder.
You're not afraid. I'm terrified.
She met his eyes steadily, but fear isn't useful right now. What's useful is that I know these mountains, I know how to move without being seen, and I know how to keep someone alive when everything says they should be dead. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks against the dark. You shouldn't be involved in this, Miko said quietly. After everything I've told you, everything I am, you should be calling the authorities or throwing me out the door. Probably, Josie stood, her hand brushing his shoulder as she passed. But I told you I'm not ready for you to leave. And I've spent 3 years running from everything that scared me. I'm tired of running. She moved to the sofa, pulling the blanket over herself. Titan shifted to make room, his warmth solid against her back. Nico remained at the table, watching her in the low light. After a moment, he rose and settled onto the floor beside the dog, his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving hers. Sleep, he said. I'll keep watch. Josie closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, the dark didn't feel like a void waiting to swallow her. The pale dawn light crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen table where maps spread like scattered cards. Josie traced a route with her finger. The Ford could make it to Lander if they kept the back roads, if they didn't attract attention. Frankie can reach us by late afternoon, Nico said, the satellite phone quiet now between them. But leaving a direct trail is suicide. Carmine's people will have eyes on every highway out of Wyoming. Josie nodded. She'd already thought it through. I have a second vehicle. Old Ford, registered to a shell company, bought it cash 2 years ago, good for emergencies, for disappearing when you need to. She pulled a set of keys from her pocket. We'll take that to Lander. Frankie brings a clean car, no ties to Chicago. Carmine's surveillance will concentrate on the main routes, airports, the logical escape points. Nico's voice carried the weight of someone who understood how hunters thought, a battered truck heading toward the mountains, toward dead ends that registers as low priority until it's too late. Exactly. He looked at her then, really looked, his dark eyes searching her face. Why are you helping me? The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. She knew the answer he wanted, the answer he was asking for without asking. Because I'm tired of being alone, she said simply. And because I think you might be too. Nico didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. He nodded once and turned to the preparations. They worked in quiet coordination, fuel in the tank, supplies packed, cash and documents sealed in a waterproof bag. Nico moved with new ease, the wound stable now, his body remembering how to function without pain. She found him clothes from a box in the closet, practical jeans, a dark Henley, the canvas jacket she'd used to drag him from the snow. The transformation was complete, no longer a wounded stranger on her sofa, but a man who owned his own presence, who filled the space like he was meant to occupy it. The satellite phone buzzed. Nico answered with a single word in Taglioni and listened. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. Frankie's in position, he said, pocketing the phone. Midday, maybe earlier. He'll confirm when he's close. Josie packed the last of the supplies, her hands steady despite the flutter in her chest. This was it, the moment she decided to stop running. Late morning brought the distant rumble of an engine, fading before it reached them. A precaution, she realized. Frankie was careful. He would call when he was ready. The phone buzzed again. Nico answered, listened, ended the call. He's waiting at the turnoff. Clean car, documentation ready. He turned to face her. Let's go. She paused at the door, Titan pressing close against her leg. The mastiff's ears were flat, his yellow eyes tracking Nico with unsettling focus. Nico caught her arm, pulling her aside before they stepped onto the threshold. His dark eyes were intent, searching her face as if committing it to memory. When this is over, he said quietly, when Carmine is neutralized and the operation is stabilized, I'm going to come back. I want you to know that's not a threat or a transaction. I'm telling you because you've earned the truth, and because I've decided that living is more interesting when it's not just about survival. Josie held his gaze, her pulse loud in her ears. If you come back, she said carefully, it won't be because you're obligated to. It won't be because you owe me. It will be because you want to be here, with me and Titan. Do you understand? I understand. He kissed her then, and it wasn't gentle. It was hungry and careful and full of the weight of everything unsaid, a promise and a prayer wrapped in a single moment of contact. She felt the truth of it in her chest, in the way her hands gripped his jacket and didn't let go. When they broke apart, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already passed between them. Nico stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching fresh snow. Frankie waited at the turnoff, a silhouette she couldn't quite make out, salt and pepper hair, weather deficiency. The clean car idled behind him. Josie watched from the porch as Nico crossed the threshold road, climbed into the passenger seat. The truck pulled away, tires grinding against packed snow, disappearing into the mountains where the trees swallowed them whole. Titan pressed against her leg, his massive weight an anchor to a world that suddenly felt unmoored. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't move. She stood there until the engine sound faded to nothing, until the silence of the mountains closed in around her like a held breath. The cabin felt different after Nico left. Josie noticed it in small ways, the silence that wasn't quite comfortable, the way she caught herself listening for footsteps that weren't there. She made coffee in the mornings and poured 2 cups before catching herself, standing at the counter with the second mug in her hand, the absurdity of the gesture settling into her chest like a stone. She didn't put the Henley away. It stayed draped over the chair by the bed, and some nights, when the cold crept in and the memories pressed too close, she took it to the sofa and pressed her face into the fabric. His cologne had faded, but something else remained. Wood smoke, danger, the ghost of a man who had made her feel something other than grief. 2 days passed. The storm that had threatened never fully materialized, but the sky stayed heavy, the light gray and oppressive. Josie kept to her routines, feeding Titan, chopping wood, checking the perimeter, but each evening brought the same strange restlessness. The mastiff paced by the windows, his yellow eyes fixed on the tree line, a low rumble vibrating in his throat. "Titan," she said softly, kneeling beside him on the second evening. "What is it, boy?" He didn't look at her. His entire body was taut, focused on something beyond the glass. Josie felt the hairs rise on her arms. She trusted that dog more than she'd trusted most humans. Pat had trained him well, and in the months after the suicide attempt, Titan had kept her alive by alerting the neighbors when she hadn't gotten out of bed for 2 days. His instincts were not wrong. She moved through the cabin in near silence, her bare feet soundless on the cold floor. The rifle was stored beneath the bedrolls, wrapped in oilcloth alongside Pat's other hunting gear. She hadn't touched it since the funeral, but her hands found it now with the ease of long muscle memory. The magazine was full. She checked by reflex, the motion automatic, her husband standing beside her in memory, showing her how to clear a jam, how to sight in, how to hold steady when everything inside you wanted to fall apart. The click of the magazine seating was too loud in the stillness. Outside, the light was failing. The gray sky had deepened to charcoal, and the first hints of wind were beginning to stir the tree line. Josie's breath fogged in the cabin as she positioned herself near the wall beside the door, rifle held low, waiting. The vehicles came up the access road like a statement. A dark sedan first, its lines expensive and out of place against the rough terrain. Then a black SUV, its tires cutting ruts in the softening snow. They stopped at the threshold, engines idling, and the doors opened in unison. 3 men emerged. Josie watched through the gap in the curtains, her pulse steady despite the ice forming in her stomach. 2 of them moved toward the cabin with the efficient confidence of professionals. The first, thin and sharp-featured, his eyes deadfish and cold, the second broader, carrying a case that clicked with specialized weight. The third stayed by the vehicles, scanning the perimeter with a weapon that glinted in the dying light. The thin one, Gino, didn't bother with stealth. He walked straight to the porch and pounded on the door, 3 sharp knocks that rattled the frame. "Open up, we need to talk." Josie let the curtain fall. Her hands weren't shaking. She noted that with distant surprise, her medical training, she supposed, the same compartmentalization that had let her stitch Nico's wound while her mind screamed. And beneath that, the simpler truth, she'd already lost everything that mattered. Whatever came next was just more loss, and losing things was something she'd become expert at. She positioned herself to the side of the door, rifle ready, and called out, pitching her voice small and frightened. "Who's there?" "We're looking for a man," Gino's voice came back. "Italian, dark-haired, injured. We believe he was brought here. We need to speak with him."
"There's no one here," Josie said through the door. "Just me. I don't know what you're talking about."
She heard the murmur of voices outside, then footsteps. The kick came without warning, the door exploding inward, slamming against the wall, and Gino was through the gap with a weapon raised, his partner right behind him. The third man stayed outside, securing the perimeter. Gino scanned the cabin, his weapon lowering slightly when he saw her. A thin woman, alone, clearly no threat. What he didn't see was Titan, massive and silent, having slipped to the far corner, yellow eyes burning in the shadows.
"Where is he?" Gino demanded. "I told you."
Josie didn't finish because Titan moved. The Mastiff exploded from the corner with a fury that shook the cabin. 400 pounds of muscle and rage hit Gino from the side, and they crashed through the window in a cascade of glass and screaming. The thin man's partner spun toward the sound, his weapon swinging, and Josie raised the rifle and fired, not at him, but at the window frame above his head. The crack was deafening in the confined space. Chunks of wood and glass exploded outward, and the hitman ducked, his shots going wild into the ceiling. Sparks rained down from the damaged lamp, and the room plunged into darkness broken only by the glow of the fire. Titana. The dog scrambled back through the broken window, blood matting his gray fur, alive and furious. The hitman was firing at shadows now, his composure shattered, and Josie used the chaos to move, crossing the room in 3 strides, positioning herself where she could see both men and the threshold beyond. The external gunman was pulling back toward the vehicles. Gino was crawling toward the porch, bleeding from defensive wounds, his weapon lost somewhere in the snow. Josie didn't fire. Instead, she called out, her voice ringing with something that surprised her authority, certainty, the voice of a woman who had just discovered she wasn't afraid. Your boss is dead to you now, so am I. You come back here, and what happened to your friend is mercy. It was a bluff, but it was a confident one, delivered by a woman whose eyes had gone the color of winter ice. The men hesitated. Then they ran. Engines roared, tires spun in the mud, and the vehicles disappeared down the access road, leaving only broken glass and blood in their wake. Josie sank to her knees. The rifle fell to her side, and her hands began to shake, fine tremors that started in her fingers and spread through her whole body. The adrenaline was fading, and the reality of what she'd done was settling over her like the first snow of winter. She'd fired at human beings. She'd chosen a criminal over her own safety. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Titan pressed against her, his massive body warm and solid, and she buried her face in his wrinkled skin. He smelled like blood and smoke and the animal jonching that had kept her alive when she hadn't wanted to be. The cabin's threshold was breached. The sanctuary was gone. Everything had changed, and Josie understood that she would have to live with the consequences of the choice she'd just made. The call came through encrypted channels at 8:30. Frankie answered, listened, then handed the phone to Nico without a word. The silence stretched as Nico absorbed the report. 3 men, a kicked-in door, a woman with a rifle, a mastiff that had torn Gino through a window. Say that again, Nico said. Josie held the cabin. Titan took out 2 of them. The third fled. Frankie's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes tracked Nico's face. She told them their boss was dead to them. Then she let them run. Nico set the phone down on the glass table. The penthouse stretched around him, 42 floors of steel and light. The city sprawled beneath the windows like a circuit board. He'd sat at this table 100 times making decisions that ended men. This was different. This was a woman in Wyoming who'd chosen violence rather than surrender his location. Boss Frankie waited. Nico's jaw tightened. Carmen's people went to her cabin. They knew I was there. We'll tighten operational security. The Salo not a leak. Nico stood, moving to the window. Lake Michigan churned black and silver under the city lights. I led them there. My wound. My tracks in the snow. I brought this to her door. Frankie said nothing. There was nothing to say. Nico turned back to the table where maps of Chicago's territories lay spread across the glass. Carmen's districts marked in red, Ferrante strongholds in black, the contested zones in gray. He'd spent 9 years building this board, learning to read its currents, moving pieces across it like a grand master. Now one woman had shown him that the game had stakes he'd never accounted for. Pull everything back, Nico said. Every favor, every dormant account, every lieutenant we've kept in reserve. I want Carmen's supply lines cut by midnight. Frankie hesitated. That's exposing our depth. If the other families, I don't care about the other families. I care about closing this. Nico pointed to the red zone downtown, Carmen's headquarters. He's isolated his own people with fear. That's a weapon. Use it. The work began in earnest. Phone calls rippled across encrypted frequencies, lieutenants confirming loyalty, confirming positions, confirming readiness. Frankie moved between Nico and the communications array, confirming each strike, each redirected shipment, each whispered conversation with Carmine's men who'd begun to wonder if their boss's gamble would pay off. By midnight, Carmine's east side distribution was in chaos. By dawn, 2 of his lieutenants had quietly switched allegiances, their loyalty purchased not with money but with the promise of stability, Nico's stability. By the second evening, Carmine was a man surrounded by walls he'd built himself, every exit sealed by the very fear he'd cultivated. Nico stood over the glass table, the map now showing Carmine's territory reduced to a single red block, isolated, vulnerable, waiting. Frankie appeared at his shoulder. Final strike is viable, but you need to be present, boss, fully present. Nico's gaze drifted to the window, to the dark line of the horizon where Wyoming lay somewhere beyond the light pollution. She'll be there, Frankie added, more softly. After. Nico nodded once. The decision was made. Carmine would be resolved quickly, cleanly, definitively, and then Nico would return to the cabin, not as a wounded man seeking shelter, as someone who chose to go back to a woman who had chosen to defend what was hers. Schedule it, Nico said. We finish this. Chapter 3. The Cost of Survival. The warehouse on South Chicago Avenue had seen better decades. Carmine sat in the office upstairs, a room that smelled of machine oil and old cigarettes, watching the street below through a cracked window. 3 cars had arrived in the last hour, not his. Each time he'd tensed, hand moving toward the drawer where he kept his weapon. Each time, the vehicles had passed. His phone had stopped ringing 2 hours ago. Try again, he said to the man standing by the door. Call Sal. Sal's phone is off. Marco unreachable. Carmine stood, moving to the window. The lot below was empty except for his own sedan, a black SUV with 2 of his remaining men and the darkness pressing in from every direction. He could feel the city differently now, not as territory he controlled, but as a trap slowly closing. Every streetlight felt like an eye. Every passing truck felt like a message. Downstairs, a door opened, footsteps on concrete. 2 sets, then 3. Frankie appeared in the office doorway, flanked by 2 men in dark jackets. He looked the same as always, practical, quiet, unremarkable. That was the point. Nico sent the ones who wouldn't make a scene. Your people are gone, Frankie said. Gino's in custody. The others are being relocated. No one died tonight. Carmine's hand drifted toward his jacket. Frankie's men didn't move, but they didn't need to. Your boss is dead, Carmine said. I made sure of it. Frankie's expression didn't change. The boss says you were useful once. You're finished now. You can accept exile or you can make it difficult and we'll make it permanent. The words hung in the air. Carmine looked at the drawer, at Frankie's calm face, at the 2 men who would end him before his hand touched the handle. He'd built everything on the assumption that Nico was gone, that the throne was empty and waiting for someone braver to sit in it. He'd been wrong. Exile where? Somewhere warm, somewhere far. Frankie stepped aside, leaving the doorway clear. You have 10 minutes to decide. Carmine sat back down. The chair creaked under his weight. Through the cracked window, he could see the city lights, the empire he'd carved from blood and loyalty, now slipping away like water through fingers. He thought about running, really running, not the strategic retreats he'd made before, but actual disappearance. He thought about the men who'd abandoned him, the lieutenants who'd promised loyalty, the life he'd built on the principle that power was the only currency that mattered. He opened the drawer. Frankie didn't flinch. The gun was cold in Carmine's hand. He looked at it for a long moment, then at Frankie, who waited with the patience of a man who'd seen this exact scene play out 100 times before.
Tell Nico,
Carmine said, that I wasn't afraid of him. I wasn't afraid of anyone.
Frankie nodded once.
The shot was louder than Carmine expected. The report reached the penthouse at 11:30. Frankie delivered it personally, finding Nico at the glass table, maps still spread before him, the city still laid out in red and black and gray. It's done, Frankie said. He chose. Nico didn't ask which choice. He already knew. He'd known since he'd given Frankie the message. What kind of man responds to exile with surrender? And what kind responds with a final act of control?
The territories?
Nico asked, consolidating.
Yeah, we might find the victory, manantesa.
We move on the east side by morning. Nico nodded. The board was clear now. The red was gone, replaced by black, his black, the Ferrante color, the color of a kingdom restored. He should have felt something, victory maybe, relief. Instead, he stood at the window, looking out at the lights of a city that had cost him everything, and wondered when exactly he'd stopped being the man who ran from violence and become the man who sent it. The city spread beneath him like a circuit board, all light and connection and current. Nico watched a plane descend toward O'Hare, its lights blinking against the dark, and thought about how easy it was to map a route from one place to another. The hard part was knowing where you actually wanted to land. Frankie had come and gone. The deed was done. Carmine had chosen the gun over exile, which told Nico everything he needed to know about the man. Not brave, just unable to conceive of a life without the trappings of power. The throne was his now, had been his for months, but the victory felt like a stone in his chest. He poured whiskey and didn't drink it. The glass table held his phone, his city, his kingdom of fear and loyalty. 9 years of his life had built this. Every decision, every execution, every quiet moment where he'd chosen the ruthless path because the merciful one was a liability. All of it had led here, to this penthouse, to this view, to this hollow ache that wouldn't release him. Josie stood in his mind like she stood in her cabin, rifle raised, jaw set, willing to defend a stranger not because she approved of him but because she'd seen something in him worth saving. The version that existed when he wasn't orchestrating the machinery of violence. The version that had sat at her table and eaten her food and let her see the wound beneath the performance. He picked up the phone. Frankie boss, a pause. Miko watched the lights of a freighter on the river, moving cargo to places that didn't know his name. How is she? Frankie understood without asking who. The cabin's secure, Taglioni's people are maintaining a perimeter. She's safe, but a longer pause. She's waiting. She needs to know you're coming back. Nico ended the call. The phone sat in his palm like a decision he wasn't ready to make. The Empire would run itself, it had to, or it was never real in the first place. The lieutenants understood the machinery. They didn't need him here, hovering over them like a specter of the old regime. They needed him like this present but not present, a name on a door, a reputation that kept the ambitious in line. He moved through the penthouse, collecting what mattered. Not the cash in the safe, not the documents, not the trappings of the life he'd built. He pulled his father's photograph from the study, his father in profile, unguarded, human, and tucked it into his jacket beside his chest, where he could feel its edges against his heartbeat. The mortgage arrangement came through a series of blind transfers, shell companies, and trusts, designed to disappear into the machinery of finance. Not charity. Never charity. A debt acknowledged, settled in the currency of the world he inhabited, quietly, completely, without expectation of thanks. She'd never know it was him, that was the point. Obligation was a chain, and she'd already given him more than she owed. He left the penthouse dark, the elevator descended, carrying him away from the throne he'd reclaimed and now planned to abandon, at least for a while. The driver waited below, the car idling at the curb, the runway clear. Wyoming waited. A cabin in the mountains, a woman with a rifle and a mastiff and a grief that matched his own. He had work to do, different work, the kind that couldn't be orchestrated from a glass table, the kind that required sitting still long enough to discover who he was when he wasn't performing the role of Ferrante. The city slid past the window, all those lights, all that territory, and Nico let it go without looking back. The knock came at dusk, Josie's hands stilled over the fire poker, and something deeper than hearing recognized the rhythm of those 3 knocks. Not the desperate pounding of that first night. Something quieter, certain. She crossed the room, Titan rising from his bed with a soft groan, and pulled the door open. Nico stood on the porch, backlit by the last purple light of evening. He wore dark jeans, a plain Henley, the canvas jacket she'd seen in his bag that first night. No car waited behind him, no phone, no satellites, no retinue. Just a man, hands empty, face open in a way she'd never seen in Chicago. "Hi," he said. The word undid something in her chest. "Hi." She stepped aside. He entered. Titan crossed the room like rolling thunder and pressed his full weight against Nico's legs, tail sweeping the air. Nico knelt, burying his face in the dog's wrinkled neck, and just breathed. When he stood, his eyes were bright. Josie moved toward him without thinking. Their mouths met, and this kiss was nothing like the first. No urgency, no desperation. It was slow, deliberate. The kiss of 2 people choosing each other again and again. Later, they sat by the fire, shoulders touching, Titan sprawled across the hearth. "Chicago's settled," Nico said quietly. "Carmen's people scattered. The family is intact." Josie waited. "I didn't kill him?" Nico's voice was low, steady. He chose the gun himself. "I want you to know that. I'm not claiming innocence. I built the trap, watched him walk into it, but I didn't pull the trigger." She nodded slowly, understanding what he was offering, not absolution, but honesty. The raw, unflinching version of himself he'd kept hidden behind suits and power. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I'm being honest about something else." He turned to face her. "I'm not here to hide. I'm not running from the Empire. I'm here because this Enni," he gestured at the cabin, the fire, the window where wind moved through pine, "is why I wanted the Empire in the first place. It's what I'm protecting. That's a lot of pressure for a cabin." "Yes." He almost smiled. "But I'm asking you to carry it with me, not because you owe me." Because somewhere in the last month, you became the person I want to build with. She held his gaze, and when you go back, I'll be back and forth. I'm restructuring, delegating, building systems that don't need me hovering. It takes time, but it's happening. He took her hand. I want to build something with you that isn't about survival. Outside, the last light faded. Inside, the fire crackled and Titan shifted to his favorite spot by the hearth. Nico and Josie sat together on the sofa, and for the first time in years, Josie allowed herself to believe in a future that included another person. The spring evening arrived with that particular quality of light that made everything look new. Josie had learned to recognize the specific shade of gold that meant sunset was imminent, the same way she'd once learned to read vital signs. These days, she was learning to read different signs: the tilt of Titan's ears when a car approached, the particular silence that meant Nico was thinking something heavy, the way the light moved across the mountains like a slow hand across a cheek. The contractor had finished the repairs by mid-March: new windows, reinforced door, a generator that purred like a contented animal. Josie had stood in the kitchen the day he left, looking at the space that had once felt like a tomb and seeing instead something that resembled potential. She'd started small, a few herb pots on the windowsill, then seeds ordered from a catalog, then a whole corner of the yard turned over to soil. The garden was nothing impressive, a patch of green pushing through brown earth, fragile and determined in the way of all growing things. But it was hers in a way that nothing had been hers since Pat died. She'd told herself she was done with the future, that wanting anything beyond the next hour was a kind of cruelty. Now she wanted things again, small things, real things. Nico arrived on a Tuesday, which was supposed to be Thursday. You're early, she said, not turning from the tomato seedlings she was carefully tamping into the ground. I wanted to be. She heard him cross the yard, the particular rhythm of his footsteps she'd learned to recognize. He stopped beside her, and after a moment his hands entered her vision, fingers working the soil beside hers. They didn't speak. The silence between them had become something comfortable, a blanket rather than a wall. Titan lay on the porch, watching them with the satisfied expression of a dog who decided that this strange arrangement, this man who smelled of cities and danger, who appeared and disappeared like weather, was acceptable, even welcome. The tomatoes were in by the time the light began to change. They washed their hands at the spigot, and Josie noticed Nico watching the garden with something like wonder. You've been busy, he said. Someone has to keep this place from going to seed. He laughed, low and rare, and the sound still did something to her chest. I'll remember that next time you burn the soup. They settled on the porch as the sun touched the ridge. This had become their ritual. Coffee and matching mugs, a gift from Nico, purchased in Lander on his first trip back, Titan's weight against their legs, the slow bleeding of color across the sky. The photograph sat inside on the mantel, but this moment was its own kind of documentation, proof that they'd made it to another evening. Nico reached into his jacket and produced a leather journal, worn at the edges like it had been carried far. I started writing, he said, about my father, about Chicago, about decisions I can't take back. Josie took it carefully, feeling the weight of the pages, the weight of what he was offering. Can I read it? Not yet. I'm still figuring it out. He looked at the mountains, the light catching the hard line of his jaw. But I wanted you to know I'm trying. To be someone who deserves this, you already are. He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw all the things he couldn't say: the years of violence, the weight of a crown he'd never wanted, the terror of wanting something pure and being unable to protect it. She saw herself reflected back, small and stubborn and somehow still standing. The sun slipped below the ridge. The sky deepened to purple, then to the particular blue-black of mountain nights. Titan shifted between them, warm and solid, a bridge between two people who had learned to trust the impossible. Inside the cabin, the lamp cast a soft glow through the window. Outside, the mountains held their silence like a promise.